Since launch, Battlefield 5 has had 12 multiplayer maps added, stretching across the earlier parts of World War II in Europe and the Pacific Theatre. And then there's one that stands out as a reimagining of a classic Battlefield map in the form of Operation Underground, and I think that's set later on in the war. But of those 12 maps, there are 2 of them that I basically forgot about because they're only available on 2 of the game modes, both of which I rarely play. These maps are Provence and Lofoten Islands. These are small, infantry-only maps that DICE released in the summer of 2019, and I'm betting they're probably the least played multiplayer maps in the game, and will probably remain so for the rest of the time that DICE works on Battlefield 5. I only remember that they existed because currently they're part of the Tides of War. These 2 maps are included in the Squad Conquest rotation, and that's what's being promoted this week. So it's kind of bringing them up out of the depths and into the sunlight for a little bit. So why are these maps so hidden then? Well, initially, they were actually slated to be maps for the 5v5 competitive mode that was set to become part of Battlefield 5 during the live service, but as we all know, that ended up being cancelled. Now, parts of that module were then earmarked for addition to the main multiplayer, and Provence and Lofoten Islands were the 2 maps that DICE decided to convert from their 5v5 layouts into ones that supported Squad Conquest, which is an 8v8 game mode, and Team Deathmatch, a 32-player mode. Now, there were rumours at the time that there were more 5v5 maps being developed for that now cancelled 5v5 mode, but officially, DICE has never stated that anything more in terms of maps will be added to Battlefield 5 from that cancelled mode, so that leaves Provence and Lofoten Islands in rather unique positions. Despite only being available for the 2 smallest modes in the game, the maps themselves are actually really good fun to play, and they take Battlefield 5 to a new location in the form of Provence, or they expand on biomes that are already present in the game. Now, Lofoten Islands is probably my favourite of these 2 maps, and that's because the aesthetic of this map is very similar to another one in Battlefield 5 that I already really like, and that's Halvøy from the Firestorm game mode. That map is set on a really rocky, sparsely populated Norwegian archipelago, and it's got various areas of that then covered in snow. It's a really harsh environment, and I think it's a really good setting for a tense Battle Royale mode, and it varies really nicely with the fact that there's a ring of fire closing in on you. It works really well. Lofoten Islands takes many of those same cues, but it does away with the firestorm and the snow as well, and it scales down the combat into 2 different zones. That's right, this map has 2 very different play zones. 2 different islands from the map as a whole are used to host the Squad Conquest and Team Deathmatch game modes. And in fact, there are 6 different islands in total across the map, so there's 4 of them not being used. Remember that point for later on in the video. For Squad Conquest, the footage that you're watching right now, the match takes place on the coast of a large mountainous island that has a small fish oil factory on it. And then for Team Deathmatch, the fighting breaks out on a more southerly island that is almost entirely taken up by civilian houses, and then that makes up a small town. The whole map of Lofoten Islands loosely follows the action of Operation Claymore in 1941. That was a British commando raid on the islands. Lofoten Islands had been occupied by Germany since their invasion of Norway in 1940, and the operation aim was to destroy fish oil production that was supplying the Germans with glycerin, which is a substance that could be used to make explosives. Now, the raid was successful, and it signalled the very first British large-scale raiding act of World War II. So, even though the map doesn't quite feel like your typical World War II fighting setting, it does fit into the narrative quite nicely. Now, having the action spread across 2 different islands, that really does make Lofoten Islands a totally unique map in Battlefield 5, more than just only being available on the smaller game modes. No other map in the game features 2 distinct fighting locations that cannot be accessed between one another. And that, to me, makes the map even more entertaining because, depending on where you want to play, you've got 2 different game modes. The slightly more urban fighting, even though it's definitely not urban fighting, that happens on the Squad Conquest game mode around the fish oil factory. That lays on some really nice flag-to-flag combat. There's more distinct lanes to that map as well. Whereas the Team Deathmatch location, all of the action just happens around the houses. They're all painted in lots of different colours. It's kind of like a crazy layout, and I really, really like it. And that island then has a very distinct look to it. Both areas support fairly balanced gameplay, and lots of different pathways you can take, lots of different routes around the map. And that means that matches tend to flow rather nicely, rather than getting stuck all the time. And there's pretty much only one improvement that I'd make to Lofoten Islands. I'd want to introduce some more solid, indestructible cover. Because most of the buildings on both of the areas are made of wood, they can very quickly be flattened, and longer lines of sight open up on relatively small maps. And it really only becomes a problem towards the end of rounds, if indeed it does become a problem, because sometimes it doesn't, but in comparison to Provence, which I'm about to talk about in a second, Lofoten Islands is an extremely destructive map, so that is something you do have to watch out for. And then let's talk about Provence, which is the other very, very small map in Battlefield 5. I think actually this one is the smallest map in Battlefield 5. It certainly feels like it when you're playing it. And the first time I did get to play it, I instantly knew that this map had been made to support 5v5 combat. It's got 3 very distinct lanes that have been built right into it. Now the map overall, it depicts a French town in the region of Provence, hence the name, that's being occupied by Germany after their invasion of France in 1940. According to in-game references, and this may well have been linked to the 5v5 game mode, but I think it's still relevant here, resistance in the area is growing stronger, and with the help of allied RAF commandos, an operation is set up to go deep behind enemy lines. That's kind of interesting. Even though the map is the smallest one available in Battlefield 5, it's arguably one of the most densely constructed. The play area sits on the western edge of the town by a small river, and that river then separates the town from the fields beyond. I've always thought DICE could have used those fields, but they decided not to. The buildings are a mix of houses, cafes and shops, and they all line these cobblestone streets that wind around and create lots of small alleyways and paths that can be used to move from point to point. There's a large church that kind of sits in the middle of the play zone. It breaks up the skyline a little bit. It's certainly the biggest building on the map that you can get to. And then outside the play zone to the east, there is a large chateau that can't be accessed, which is something worth remembering when we speak about expanding these maps in a moment. The colour palette of the map, that can pretty much be described as extremely beige and uninspiring. Probably the only thing that I don't really like about this map now that I've played it a little bit more, which is a shame because the gameplay of the map is almost perfect on Squad Conquest and Team Deathmatch. And I think because the map was always designed to have a small number of players on it, when you're playing 8v8 Squad Conquest, it works brilliantly. I can look past the colours though, the tight pathways that link together, all of those raised and lower buildings, they really let players get stuck into the action and hold down angles like no other map really does in Battlefield 5. Once DICE gets their act together with the community games feature, and hopefully they can create some permanent server systems for us so that we can host our own servers and they don't go away, I could see lots of people running Provence 24/7 TDM servers because, honestly, of all the TDM maps in this game, this is the best one, by a country mile. Now, just then I mentioned the word expansion. There aren't any plans to expand these two maps beyond what is already available, but I think it's always a topic of conversation when these two maps do come up in the conversation that maybe they should have been transformed into something bigger instead of just being only for the small game modes. I'd love it if DICE could go back and rework some of these maps into larger ones that would maybe support the Conquest game mode, which is clearly the most popular one in Battlefield 5. Lofoten could be really interesting as kind of like an island hopping map. I mentioned there are 6 islands on Lofoten Islands and only 2 of them are being used for the 2 small game modes, so maybe fighting across the islands to capture flags placed on them, that could be really cool. With it being a map that's set between the British and the Germans, there's maybe scope to add the Schwimmwagen from Firestorm onto the map as a way of getting across the water, and maybe the dinghy boats that we've seen on some of the Pacific maps too. Of course, in the game at the moment, there aren't any tanks on the British or the German factions that support any kind of naval combat, so perhaps the fighting would be restricted to these kind of lighter vehicles that I mentioned, but it would create the opportunity to have some island-hopping gameplay that would be restricted to just lighter vehicles, I guess. It would certainly change the map up a little bit and make it a unique one available in Battlefield 5. And then with Provence, well, the opportunity here is to incorporate the fields beyond the river, maybe extending the map outwards a little bit and allowing some kind of vehicle role to come into the fighting. Now, with German occupation in this area, it's set around 1942, 1943, so the chances of a British Churchill tank turning up are pretty much next to none, but perhaps the map could support light tanks like the Staghounds and the Panzer 38T. It would kind of break away from the historical accuracy of the setting, but then again, we are playing a video game, so I'm not sure how much that really matters to too many people out there, but maybe extending the town a little bit further, incorporating the chateau, that could be really cool as well. But do I really expect DICE to do all of this? No, not really. I think they've got higher priority issues that they need to sort out, and I think they've probably already got a content plan that they want to stick to for 2020. Likely these two maps, Lofoten Islands and Provence, they're already at their memory budget with next to no room for anything else to happen with them, so going back in development and working these things around again, that would likely take just as much time as it did to make the maps in the first place, and of course if you're asking level designers and level artists to redo all of that work, then they can't be working on brand new maps that maybe go into a different theatre. But if DICE did want to spend some time recycling some of their older content in order to come out with a better set of maps, then maybe this is something they could consider. But there we go, just my thoughts because, well, I've barely played these maps over the last 6 months or so, and they're now available and highlighted within that playlist for the next week or so. So maybe you should just go and give them a go and see if you like it. But thanks very much for watching. Leave me a rating and a comment. It is always appreciated. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.